at the Musial with Alan and Daniel. We'll talk about the Cardinals all night long. Everyone come gather round, listen to your favorite sound. We'll talk about the Cardinals all night long. We'll talk the games and all the rest, about the team that we love best. We'll talk about the Cardinals all night long. We're gonna talk about the Cardinals all night long.
Good evening. Welcome into another edition of Meet Me in Mutual. I'm your host, Daniel Shoptaw at C70 on the Twitters. Alan's still finishing up with the high school baseball. We should be having him back here pretty soon, but filling in that spot tonight is Blake Newberry. You know Blake from Viva El Birdos. You know him from CardinalNation.com. You find him on Twitter at BT_Newberry. He's everywhere. It's Blake. How are you doing tonight, Blake?
Doing great, Daniel. It's good to be joining you and talking some baseball.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this. A lot of good conversation to be had. But I before we get into this, I told you we're going to start the major league team, but I don't know if we will or not. But I wanted to tell you that I went to see the Razorbacks play yesterday in
Nice.
Fayetteville, and on my way up there and on the way back, I was listening to podcasts. I listened to three different podcasts, and every one of them referenced your story on Viva El Birdos about the pitching philosophy. Have you gotten a lot of good feedback on that one? Maybe more than some others that you've done?
No, I actually had no idea that has been picked up anywhere. I saw the Cardinals player development Twitter account retweeted it, and that's about all I knew.
Oh, well, like that's a good one to retweet too, though. But it's very interesting to get that kind of dive into there and to actually see some tangible changes in a system that needed it.
Yeah, 100%. I think that was one of the things I've been most encouraged by is the changes that we've seen in pitching development where they're like you actually look at some of these guys like Matthew Liberatore is a great example of this, or Sem Bursa, who's actually made the change where you look at these guys like, wow, they have some secondaries that are really good and their fastball is terrible. Why do they throw like 60% fastballs? It
Mhm.
makes no sense. Liberatore still does it to an extent. But Sem Bursa's dropped to like 25% fastballs, and he's just throwing cutters, sliders, and changeups galore, and he's having a breakout season so far. So it's really nice to see the Cardinals kind of shy away from a fastball heavy approach that they've had for a long time now, and be a little more willing to kind of tweak pitch arsenals based on the qualities of the individual pitcher.
Yeah, to go along with that though, you notice that they're not necessarily taking those guys that can throw hard, the few that they have, and turning them into relievers like they did with Helsley and Hicks and that group that they. I don't know. I mean, it feels like at least with those kind of guys, even though they've had success at the major league level, they kind of stunted their development and they could have possibly been so much more than just a one inning guy.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, you always play the what if game with guys
Mhm.
like that. I mean, we've seen what Jordan Hicks has done in San Francisco, and he's always had premium arm talent. He just never really got the chance to put it together in St. Louis, coming up from like high A baseball and not getting the chance to stay in the rotation. And Ryan Helsley, I mean, he was in the rotation up through AAA, but you see how dominant he is now, and you just kind of wonder, like, what if he'd had a longer leash as a starter? What things have turned out and put him into maybe a more higher value role than being a closer. And I actually that's one of the things that I touched on in the article too with the Cardinals letting Edwin Nunez pitch out of the
Mhm.
rotation.
Mhm.
He's a guy who he does have a lot of like issues with pitch shapes and control and repeatability of mechanics and all sorts of things like that he has to work out. But he does have that premium arm talent, and the Cardinals have stuck him in a rotation or in a bullpen role pretty much his entire career. And now they're actually giving him that chance to start. And even if it doesn't work out, it's just good process to let your guys who have the most electric arsenals actually get a chance to pitch in the biggest roles.
Right, right. I mean, work your way up, and if it doesn't, you can always fall back on the bullpen.
Exactly.
But I think we have seen going from the bullpen to the starting rotation is something that they sometimes talk about. I mean, you go all the way back to Trevor Rosenthal in the spring. They keep talking about that stretch him out for a starter, but it just never really seems to translate. In fact, that's why I was a little bit, very surprised that the Giants were doing that with Jordan Hicks. Now, obviously, it's worked very well, but that step back into the rotation seems to be, at least in the Cardinal organization, maybe a little bridge too far to go.
Yeah, it is, and I think it'll be interesting to kind of see what happens with like guys like Zach Thompson and Andre Palante this year,
Hmm.
because both of them have struggled in the major league rotation. They've gone back down to AAA. Zach Thompson has been a starter this year, but Palante has been a reliever since he came up, and he basically skipped AAA as well because the Cardinals like the arm. So I'm curious to see if they're actually going to give Palante some leash to see if he can actually go back and develop as a starter. I know the results really haven't been there at a major league level recently, but there are some things to like in his arsenal. And he's a guy who I am very intrigued to see if he can actually put things together.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think you use the name in the article. But how much does this translate to Heim Bloom becoming an advisor in the organization, do you think?
See, I didn't mention it in the article because I have no idea because we simply don't know how much Chaim Bloom does in the front office. But if I were just simply throwing a guess out there, I'd say it's pretty notable that these changes happened after he was hired. So I
Mhm.
would assume with him being kind of the pitching guru from the Rays, that bringing him into the organization and these changes happening, there's some correlation there for sure.
Yeah, it feels like there has to been because again, like you said, the Cardinals have done the same thing for what 10, 15 years probably now, and then to all of a sudden change when they finally get a little bit of fresh blood into the organization. I mean, could be coincidence, but it seems unlikely. But then also, the Cardinals probably recognized that they did need to do something different. So at least they were open to any kind of changes that whoever may have brought into the organization. Because that's in the past, I don't know that they would have been right. I think they would have probably just stuck with what had worked for 10 years.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, I think that was one of the my favorite parts of Chaim Bloom being hired, besides the fact that he was actually hired, is that
Hmm.
Mosaic in his press conference was literally just straight up said, "We need some kind of an outside voice to come into this organization." And I don't think that's something that he would have said even a year before. It's not something that the Cardinals have typically said. So it definitely shows at least a shift in thinking and a willingness to try things that they haven't tried very often in an effort to actually kind of overhaul how they do things. So that's at least encouraging.
Yeah, it only took a last place finish and 71 wins,
Yeah.
to make a crack into that facade, but, you take your silver lining, I guess, from whatever we had last year, and if it's a situation where it turns into, a very strong pitching development over the next 4 or 5 years, then that'd be great, because this is an organization that has had success developing pitchers for a while, it just has somehow gotten away with it, probably because the game has changed on them.
Yeah, that's definitely just what it is. The game has changed, and I mean that's something I've touched on in the article is that teams have stopped throwing fastballs. That the fastball rate has been declining for probably
Mhm.
about a decade now, and the Cardinals are only just now catching up to that trend. But even then, sinkers used to be in vogue, and you chase pitch movement, throw pitches at the knees, things like that. That high forcing fastball with riding life and high velocity is now the thing. And the Cardinals were been just a little bit slow to catch on to that. And it's even from a development perspective, but it's also from a drafting perspective. They draft guys like Michael McGreevy and Dakota Hudson and Jake Woodford in the first round. And those are guys who just don't simply possess the kind of arsenal that's ever going to pitch at the top of a rotation. So it's a talent identification issue as much as a talent development issue.
Yeah, and a risk, um,
Yeah, that plays
aversion
a big
to
role
tone
too.
too, right? I mean, you know what you're going to get out of a Dakota Hudson or a Michael McGreevy. You're gonna get probably a guy that's gonna make the major leagues and is going to be able to contribute here and there, but he's never gonna be something special. And that is good enough at times, depending on where you are in your development and in your winning cycle. I mean, as a staff like that with the MVP with MV3 behind them, then sure you can do that. But they don't have that anymore.
Yeah, no, they don't. And I mean that we'll see. I mean, what happens with this draft if the Cardinals decide that they want to kind of find a guy who has more swing and miss than what they've targeted typically in the first round. The pitching class isn't as strong this year as maybe it has been in the past, but there's opportunity for the Cardinals to do so. But what I do think is actually interesting too is we see the Cardinals go for those like McGreevy, Woodford, Hudson types in the first round a lot of times, and then we'll see them in like the eighth round take a pitcher with like 3,000 RPM spin rates and like velocity up to the upper 90s for relievers. And I'm like, well, if we're targeting this in like the eighth round, why wouldn't we do the same thing on a more polished pitcher in the first round? So It's a little weird to me. I'm hoping that they just kind of catch up and be a little bit more aggressive at the top of the draft and actually try to find that impact talent. Because even then, if you have a guy with high ceiling, even if he doesn't hit his ceiling, he's still can fall back on being a good reliever, being a back end starter. There's just a lot. The range of outcomes is a lot higher.
Yeah. I think, I don't know how this is going to come off, but I don't really mean it that way. But I do think there's a desire for more bang for your buck, right? I mean, they want to take that guy in the eighth round because they can get third round talent out of him, or at the fraction of the cost. I think every front office, but I think maybe the front office of the Cardinals is trying to always do as much as they can with as little as they can. And that idea of we're a little bit smarter than everybody else. I think front offices fall into that trap a lot, right? Of the that we're going to take this guy here, and it's going to turn out to be a huge benefit for our organization, instead of playing it safe and taking the guy that just as good in the second round.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, that's something the Cardinals frankly have done really well, actually, is drafting in
Mhm.
day two in that like third to 10th round kind of range. It feels like they always just pull talent out of that. A lot of times it's position players like Lars Nootbaar or Tommy Edman, but there are a couple interesting pitchers in the organization. I mean, even Gordon Graceffo, who were kind of drafted in that range. So they actually do a fantastic job drafting kind of in the middle of the draft. I would just love to see that success kind of come around early on that day one of the draft.
Do you think that this is? I know that Randy Flores has quite the reputation because of the 2020 draft, especially. But do you think this is? I don't want to say make or break, but maybe a little bit close to that kind of draft because of where they're drafting and because of what has happened over the last couple of years, where it hasn't necessarily been a lot of home runs coming out of the draft.
I don't know if it's necessarily make or break, just because I'm not sure there's ever one draft class that can really be considered make or break for a team.
Yeah.
Because every year we look at picking seventh in the draft, and it's very true that the Cardinals could pull an impact player out of the draft. I think there's probably like 8 to 10 guys who you look at as like very surefire top 10 picks. And it's nice that the Cardinals are in that range, but we also see guys that get impact talent like in the 30th pick of the draft or the 25th, like, or even guys who come in the fifth round. So I think it's not necessarily a make or break draft, but it is the kind of draft where you do really hope that the Cardinals are pulling a guy who's becomes like a top five, top three, top one kind of prospect in the system here in a few years.
Yeah, yeah, I think it is a big deal, and I just think I also, it feels like if this season doesn't turn around, we're looking at some sort of upheaval in the front office as well. And again, you're right, because you can't judge a draft right after it. You have to judge it 2 or 3 years down the road, if that. But you still wonder if they start cleaning house, where do they stop? And having a very high prospect, a high level prospect coming in this year may help that broom go somewhere else.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that'll be the interesting thing is I don't think Mozeliak gets fired because I think
Mhm.
the plan is basically to have him see out his contract and he's willing to step away. So I think this is one where maybe Randy Flores has a killer draft and tries to put himself in the conversation for next GM.
Yeah.
There's obviously going to be a couple of candidates, but I do think we're going to see some upheaval both in the front office and or the coaching staff if there's another rough year.
Yeah, and like we said, Mo's contract's up at 25, so even if he makes it to the end of the contract, and I agree with you. I don't think they fire him. I think they reassign him to some degree, put him in a charge of something different for that last contract. He's done too much with this organization for them to let him go with a year left on the
Yeah.
contract. But even a good year this year and a good year in 25, he's probably not coming back. I think it's just that time, and so this is again, if you want to look at, he's been here since 2007 as a GM. He was, under Jockety longer than that. You are really starting to talk about that kind of era shift. And, again, Bill DeWitt is in his early 80s. What's that going to look like? And I don't know. I think that we have been so spoiled or used to this continuity that this organization has, that it may really take a hit over the next season or two.
Yeah, it might. And that's where it's going to be interesting of it feels like if you kind of think Moselak's done after this contract, you can have him kind of hand training the successor to come after him from inside the
Mhm.
organization. And that would kind of prevent some upheaval in the front office and maybe make it a more seamless transition. From a coaching staff perspective, I mean, they did just re-sign Marmol, so maybe they're committed to him, but I would think another rough year is probably not going to survive that. And at that point, that feels like an outside voice is going to come in, as opposed to a guy coming in internally, would just be my guess after the
Yeah.
way last season went, and assuming this season goes poorly, which it might not. But yeah, it does feel like the Cardinals are going to be in a time of a little bit more upheaval than we're used to.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about this season then. I know your most recent article over at Viva was talking about how the offense is probably not this bad, but I still came away reading this as it may not be this bad, but it may not be nearly as good as we kind of have in our heads. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think that's accurate, and I think a lot of it really is well. In the article, I looked at numbers like batting average on balls in play, which tends to normalize around 300. The Cardinals are really underperforming there. Like the difference between WOBA and expected weighted on base average, and they're underperforming there. Those numbers tend to regress to the mean over large samples. That doesn't mean it will, but generally you tend to see upward movement if you're underperforming. So with the Cardinals, it looks like right now they're a bottom five offense in baseball. Those numbers would have them right around middle of the pack. So you could say we likely will see movement up to middle of the pack. Doesn't mean we will, but the odds are that they will move upwards. But this isn't a team that's built to make the playoffs with a middle of the pack offense.
Right.
This is a team that's built to make the playoffs with a top five, top eight kind of offense. And if the Cardinals can't get there, that's going to be a problem. And I think a lot of that is going to have to be led by guys like Paul Goldschmidt, Nolan Arenado, and to a lesser extent, Nolan Gorman and Jordan Walker, all of whom have been struggling. So, depending on how long it takes those guys to get back on track, assuming they do get back on track, that's really to me what determines where the season's going to go.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I think you can't expect this team to go real far with looking like washed up Paul Goldschmidt and an Arenado that has what Jeff Jones put out, 1 home run in the last 200 something at bats.
Yeah.
That's just not what this team's designed for. They don't have to be MVP guys, but they've got to be at least solid contributors, and we're not seeing that. I mean, I think we've seen a little bit of Paul Goldschmidt starting to wake up a little bit, but it's still the power's not there for anybody.
Yeah, I mean that's the concerning thing is you look up and down this lineup, and at least before this season, I'm like, oh great, you have like 15, 20 home run guys just everywhere, just
Hmm.
scattered like 1 through 7, 1 through 8 in the lineup. And now it's Jordan Walker's back in AAA. Nolan Arenado's hitting like singles and some doubles, but he's not clearing the fence. Paul Goldschmidt, same thing. Nolan Gorman is struggling. It's like all these guys who you would expect to even be 30 to even 40 home run guys. I'm now like you're now just hoping they get to 20, and
Hmm.
and that does have a big impact. And frankly, it's probably the most surprising part of this season to me so far.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people as they struggle, especially when they were struggling. I mean, they've played a little bit better as of late, but right there at the beginning of the year when they start, all the comparisons to 2023, there were a lot of people that were really, upset at the front office, which is typical. But I was also like, look, this front office went out and improved the pitching staff, and and it's working, right? The pitching staff is fine, especially the bullpen. Bullpen's been great. They didn't go out and fix the offense because they didn't think they had to. Nobody thought they had to, and I don't know, what they can do to this. I mean, do you think it's as simple as, somebody somewhere along the way they've gotten a bad approach to this whole thing, or is it a whole bunch of different combinations that one simple fix is not going to happen?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. Where there's a lot of factors, right? Like
Hmm.
there's some poor batted ball luck in there. I think we've heard some players talk about wanting to use the opposite field more, which like I get it. I understand that you want to hit the ball the other way. Like if I'm a hitter and I have like an 0-2 slider down in the way, yeah, I'm just going to try to slap that thing to right field.
Right,
But
right.
you look at guys like Noel Arenado, who's made a living on pulling the ball in the air over the fence. If you're asking him to hit the other way more, that's just asking him to do the exact opposite of what made him successful. So I think there's a little bit of an approach change there. We've seen the Cardinals, which this is probably my weirdly like negative favorite stat of the season, where they are the second worst team in baseball when it comes to hitting pitches straight down the middle. they have a 266 weighted on base average, which is weighted the same way as OBP. So it's like a 266 OBP on pitches straight up right down the middle. They're
Uh,
not swinging aggressively against them, and they're just not hitting meatballs. And it's weird. It's like, how do you, what do you just walk up to Paul Goldschmidt and say, "Hey, hit the 92-mile-an-hour fastball down the middle better"? Like, it's just bizarre to me.
yeah, it is. I mean, these guys. I mean, maybe with a Goldschmidt, and I don't think this is completely the case, but he's 36. Maybe you start saying, okay, the bat's fleet slower or something of that nature. But a lot of these guys are still not even haven't even hit their prime yet, much less, on the backside of it. They should be doing more that you would think. So and again, it's not as simple as firing the hitting coach. And you never, I mean, again, I think that's something that we reflex try to go to as a solution. And I don't know that it always is, but you also wonder if they don't need some sort of voice that says, hey, that pitch, hit it. Maybe it's just instead of being too complicated, maybe they just need somebody in there that gives them at least gives them the information in a different way.
Yeah, I agree, and it's always hard to kind of say, well, should the Cardinals fire their hitting coach if they're not hitting
Hmm.
well, because we don't know what the hitting coach is saying behind the
Right.
scenes. And I think it's really easy for fans to just be like, yeah, the Cardinals aren't hitting well. That's the hitting coach's fault
Hmm.
because we don't know what he's doing, so we can just say he's doing nothing or he's doing something wrong. And I always hesitate to say that poor hitting is the fault of the hitting coach and not the hitters who are actually stepping into the box. But while I'm not quick to blame the hitting coach for struggles, like at a certain point, you just need to maybe shake things up and just light a fire or get a new voice into the dugout or something. Like you don't even know if it's going to work, but it feels like you're kind of out of options at a certain point. And with the season kind of trending the way it has been, you almost wonder if that's something the Cardinals are going to consider this year pretty soon.
Yeah, I think it's a very good possibility. I continue to always think back to I think it was back it was one of the last couple years of Matheny. But early June, the Cardinals, got rid of the hitting coach and cleared up the staff quite a bit. Left Matheny in place, which may have been, missing out on some of the options, some of the obvious things. But anyway, I still remember because it was like a week or so or a few days before Blogger Day. So of course that was where we asked all our questions. But I think it was to some degree is like, look, we're just trying something new, so trying to get a different voice, trying to get a different look and maybe trying to get some attention on these players because I don't think the players are going out there, without a focus. But sometimes, somebody losing their job gets people motivated in different ways. Especially when, because these guys they're with each other all the time. They don't want to see anybody get fired. And I don't think we as fans do either. But like you said, sometimes it's just got to be that way. You've got to do something. And you can't trade half the players. I mean, that's just not going to happen.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing. You can fire one coach, but you can't fire 25 players. So
Right.
unfortunately, it's the coach's head who's on the chopping block when that happens. And I do think that baseball is such a quantifiable sport. There's a lot of things that you just can't quantify when it's such a mental sport too,
Hmm.
and you almost just wonder like if you fire a hitting coach and then 25 guys sitting in the dugout realize that basically it's your fault that this guy over here that you like just got fired. Do they start hitting better? Like it's just I don't really know how all of this works, but I just look at Turner Ward and I'm like I don't know what you do, but I do know that Ollie Marmol just got an extension. So if there's somebody getting fired first, it's probably not going to be him. And the pitching's doing fine, so it's probably not going to be the pitching coach. That really leaves you with one option.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's very interesting because we were kind of sold on that Turner Ward was just really gonna be like Jeff Albert without the baggage, right? That he was gonna be the guy that was gonna continue what the Cardinals were doing in the offensive, philosophy that they were trying to rework this organization, but he was gonna give it a different face. He was a guy that had played baseball, and so everything was gonna be, kind of a blend of old and new, and there wouldn't be that target on the back like there was with Jeff Albert. And it doesn't seem to be the case. I mean, you saw the stat that they showed about, pulled fly balls and
Yep.
how it was terrible before Albert got here. It was really, really good while he was here. And now, as soon as he left, it's been terrible again. It doesn't, it seems very strange that it really would seem strange that it's not a change in philosophy if you're seeing such drastic changes in stats.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing is you can look at it and see the changes in stats. And like some of it might be, we brought in different players like Wilson Contreras who didn't
Mhm.
pull the ball a ton in the air last year. He's gotten better at it this year. But when you look at guys like Nolan Arenado, and now he's not pulling the ball in the air as much.
Right.
Paul Goldschmidt, he's not pulling the ball in the air as much. These guys who have done it consistently and really did it under Jeff Albert, when they drop off when Albert's gone, it's pretty easy to attribute that to a change in philosophy.
It's fascinating to think about, though, like Goldschmidt and Arenado changing what worked for them, right? I mean, just 2 years ago, both of these guys are MVP, one's MVP, one's third. And then it's like they went and tinkered. And I get there's this probably natural, idea with baseball players that they got to keep modifying to stay on top of things. But you'd think that as strong as they were in that season, they'd at least, if they were tinkering, they would have just minor things instead of significantly overhauling everything. And yet that seems to be the case. And I don't know why they would do that, and I don't know why they haven't gone back to what worked.
Yeah, it's so weird. Like I understand what a guy like Paul Goldschmidt was trying to do because
Mhm.
when you get older, your bat speed slows down. So maybe do some bat speed training and you try to speed it back up. Or you're Paul Goldschmidt and you've never been able to hit the outside pitch well in pretty much your entire career. So maybe you try to tweak your stance or your swing or whatever to try to reach the outside pitch better. But at a certain point, like all of hitting is connected. If you're trying to change your stance or your bat path to hit the outside pitch, then you're changing your bat path to hit the inside pitch or the pitch right
Mhm.
down the middle. And maybe now all of a sudden your results aren't as good. I'm not saying that's the case, but a lot of times one tweak to improve one area can sometimes lead to the same tweak making a couple other areas worse. So it's the kind of thing where you like I'm okay with seeing these guys go out and trying to improve weak spots of their game or trying to stay ahead of the aging curve. But at a certain point, if it's not working, you do want to see them go back to whatever they were doing before.
Yeah. And you gotta adjust your game. Well, like we saw that with Albert Pujols, right? He changed his game somewhat. He kind of sold out for power and things of that nature. He wasn't quite the same player, but he was still very effective. You may just have to not, to let that average go and swing for more power or something of that nature. I don't know. But again, we're a month into this season, but it's the fact that, and I think is it, how fair is it? I guess maybe is to say to take the fact it's not just 1 month, but it's 7 months counting last year.
Yeah, I think it's fair. I hesitate to use the end of last year too
Yeah,
heavily when I'm looking
sure.
at things just because of the guys that were actually playing games. Like
Mhm.
Irving Lopez was out there, Jose Fermin was out there for a little bit, Taylor Motter, like guys that just aren't really major league caliber were out there a lot of the time. So when I look at like the macro results of the Cardinals were terrible after the trade deadline, like of course they were. They traded everybody away. That
Right.
doesn't excuse the fact that they were bad before the trade deadline, but that it's hard to attribute that drop off after the trade deadline to them being a substantially worse team. But I do think it's significant when you go back and look at the results of a guy like Nolan Arenado or Miles Michaelis, who also struggled at the back half of last year and has not really turned things around. So it is a little bit more concerning when you see a prolonged stretch like that for those guys.
Yeah. And talking about other guys that have struggled this year, with it, we're just a week away, or it was about this time last week when the Cardinals sent back Jordan Walker back down to AAA. And you had another article because you're writing all the time, and all this stuff that is so good, about how AAA exists for a reason. And I really I talked about it before I read that. I was talking a little bit to some others about how much did the fact that Mason Wynn got to play all of last year basically in AAA help him versus Jordan Walker getting 2 good weeks of spring and then getting to make the major league roster. And I think you really kind of hit on that with him and with Victor Scott is we tend to, as fans, and I guess the front office kind of biting into this, see these guys and just shooting up the or of up the organization, but they kind of need a little bit of time at some of these spots and let them figure it out at AAA before they're coming up to the majors.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I look at a guy like Jordan Walker, and it's you don't know what you're going to get from him at the major league level when he's in Double A and just
Mhm.
killing the ball. All you do is you see him crushing the ball, and you dream on his ability to crush the ball in the majors. But you tend to gloss over maybe some of the other warts in his game, like the fact that he's never played right field before, which obviously mattered a lot last year. Or you look at a guy like Victor Scott and you say, hey, we need somebody to play center field. How about we call up this guy with half a season of Double A experience? And while he might be a little rough around the edges, look how fast he is. Of course, he's going to play a great center field and steal a ton of bases and bunt his way on. But then you kind of gloss over the fact that, well, he actually isn't that refined of a center fielder. And his bat obviously needs a lot of work. And when you take them as a whole, while they do have the great tools, they actually need to refine some of those weak spots in their game to actually be complete players that are actually going to be important contributors at the major league level. So I'm not a huge fan of having either of those guys, or plenty of guys in the past, skipping levels just to try to rush them up to the majors because you like what you see.
Yeah, yeah. It seems, we were all arguing. I think a lot of us were arguing about, not having Jordan Walker join the team last year for various reasons. The 40-man roster reasons, and the fact that he hadn't been at Memphis and all this other stuff. And it seems to pay out now. He had a pretty decent second half, and hopefully that's what we'll see again this year. But again, I think that you start wondering again. We talked about Jordan Hicks and others that have come up quickly, and you start wondering what could they have been if they had had a more, a slower, more steady progression. And I hope we don't have to find that out especially with Jordan Walker and Victor Scott. I think that at least Jordan Walker had some success at the major league level. Victor Scott really didn't. And I hope that that's not something that's going to linger with him as he, then tries to figure out AAA.
Yeah, I agree. And that's always the part that I get concerned about. And it's also the part we just don't know is what's the
Mhm.
mental makeup of a player? How does he handle failure? Does it stick in his head, or does he just brush it off and take feedback from it and go back and work on some of those holes in his game? And it sounds like that's kind of the guy that Victor Scott is, where he didn't seem like his spirits were dampened by his struggles in the majors. It felt like he was ready to just go down to AAA, work on what he has to work on, and get back up here, which is great. And I admire that. So I'm not as concerned about that stunting his development. But it's just the kind of thing with you just don't want to mess with it.
Mm.
And it's funny. I understand the Jordan Walker thing. I don't really understand that much because the Cardinals had a number of outfielders and it felt like they
Right.
just wanted to call him up early and put him in right field. I understand the Victor Scott thing a little bit because you had like three center fielders get injured
Mhm.
before Victor Scott. But I also think it's funny that I wrote like articles for 3 consecutive weeks arguing to start Michael Ciani of all people in center field, which is obviously not an exciting option. But then it's what the Cardinals ended up doing because I would rather play the mediocre kind of 4A guy as opposed to the extremely promising prospect and kind of risk hurting the development there if he's not ready, and he wasn't.
Yeah, I mean, and if they had played Ciani instead of Victor Scott, they probably had a little bit better offensively, right? I mean, that's just the way it turned out. You wouldn't expect that, but Victor Scott was pretty lost there. And yeah, I agree. I think that, yeah. And again, maybe you're not talking. Maybe you don't worry about it as much if you think if the offense is going around, right? I think that's part of and maybe a little bit of why Jordan Walker went down is because you can't afford to let him figure it out at the major league level when Gorman and Arenado and Goldschmidt are doing what they're doing. And not that he didn't need to go down anyway, but I wonder if the rest of the offense was clicking, whether they would have said, okay, we can fix this up here.
Yeah, and I mean they might have, which it's just kind of the thing when you look at this roster, it always felt a little bit questionable when you had Victor Scott on it to start the year, and again
Hmm.
injuries and all that. But starting like Jordan Walker, who obviously has concerns about his defense, and Victor Scott, who has concerns about his overall game, and Mason Wynn, who we didn't know that he was going to be
Right,
as
right.
good as he has been at this point. You're looking at just a number of guys in the lineup with significant question marks. And that's typically not what you look at for a playoff team. So definitely concerning to have like three guys like that in your lineup. Whereas you're right, if you have your entire team firing on all cylinders, like sure, bring Jordan Walker up and let him try to figure some stuff out at the major level. He can hit 9-hole, or like Victor Scott can maybe work on his game while the other 8 hitters are crushing the ball. But
Hmm.
it wasn't really the situation that we had in either this season or the last season.
Yeah. So we've talked a little about not rushing people up. Um, Sim Reverse has had a very good start, and we know that Steven Matz's back is kind of talking to him. What are the odds that the Cardinals fall for that trap and Sim makes his next start in St. Louis?
I think the odds are not insignificant because Sam Roberto is probably the best starter they could call up to fill the Steven Matz gap if it ends up existing.
Mhm.
Um, I've I'm so torn on it because I hate the idea of putting the 22-year-old pitcher with like 5 AAA starts into the
Right.
rotation. But the Cardinals also need to win games. So it's kind of hard, like, who do you go with? That you just want to call it Michael McGreevy because he's had the most experience in AAA and just see if he can cut it as a 5 starter for a little bit? Do you want to bring Zach Thompson up if he hasn't figured out his mechanics, weight loss, velocity decline, whatever it is with that? So I'm really hoping they don't fall into the Sam Robersa trap of bringing him up as a 22-year-old. But I do think the changes that he's made this year are they bode well for him moving forward. I think his biggest issue was that his fastball was bad, and
Mhm.
he doesn't have a good fastball now. He just doesn't throw his fastball. So that's how he's gotten around it, and that's an approach that can work at the majors because he still lives in the zone enough, and he has two pitches that can miss bats at a high rate. Like, I think that's enough to say if he comes up to the major leagues, he's not going to be a train wreck. I just don't necessarily want to risk it. I'd rather just let him settle into AAA, have sustained success, and prove to himself that he can do it before he really gets called up into a higher visibility spot in the majors.
But this is where we get into that whole Cardinals don't have depth thing, right? I mean, you're right. There's not exactly a really great option to do this if Steven Matz can't go. And given the way we saw what Steven Matz did last time, it feels pretty strongly like he probably can't. But yeah, I mean, I agree. I don't think I think Michael McGreevy is. We just lost Dakota Hudson. We don't need to bring him up again. And I haven't seen anything about Graceffo. I guess that would be the other name that has been had at least some success and some experience at AAA. That although I don't think he's a 40-man guy, is he?
Yeah, he's not, so he would have to be
Yeah,
added,
yeah,
which is what Robersa has going for him, is that he's already on the 40 man, which just makes it easier for the Cardinals to fall into that trap if they want to.
yeah. Yeah, I think that's gonna be very interesting to see. I guess if nothing else, it gives that little shot of excitement too to a team that might need it. I mean, because we've talked about the psychology of this kind of stuff again, but if you got a young guy that comes up and actually does well, maybe that is a little bit of a boost to a team that needs it.
Yeah, I mean, it very well could be, and it's kind of the point where it's like I don't want them to call up Sam Robersa, but I don't know who I want them to call up if they have to.
Mhm.
So this is frankly not a very fun position for John Mozeliak to be in, because it's kind of a no-win situation unless you really just want to roll the dice and maybe Sam Robersa comes up and then he actually pitches well, and then you're like, look at that, it all worked out great.
Yeah.
But yeah, I honestly don't even know where the Cardinals should go with this.
I guess the best case, maybe if you had to do something, is that if I guess best case would be Steven Matz goes on the injured list for 15 days, so it's like 2
Yep.
starts for Robersa, and then when Matz comes back, they definitely send him back down because I think that's what the Cardinals don't, and a lot of flood teams, but Cardinals don't want to do either, right? If they've had some success in the major leagues, they're going to keep them up there instead of taking what they get and then sending them back for a little bit more seasoning.
Yeah, exactly. I think if that's the case, I don't mind them calling up Robersa as much if Mats is going to miss like 2 or 3 starts and there's a legitimate end date in mind for Robersa, like, hey, you come up, you take the ball 3 times, you go back down regardless of results. That's great. Unless like
Mhm.
Robersa's striking out like 15 guys a game and then
Right?
you
Yeah.
just really can't send him down. But that's okay. Like those 3 starts, that might be enough of like a taste for him to kind of see what the majors is like without exposing him to the risk of sustained domination basically by other hitters. So that's probably the ideal scenario, and then it also kind of lets the Cardinals maybe see what they have in Robersa at the major league level, and if the changes that he's made can actually let him basically jump AAA and already have success in the majors.
Yeah, yeah, I think that it should be kind of interesting. So let's use that to then springboard into what the minor league season has looked like. You're here getting close to a month of minor league games, and what are you seeing? I mean, I know we've talked about the pitching philosophy and that kind of stuff, but just at each level, is there anything that's standing out to you?
Yeah, I think as we talk about AAA not having a ton of rotation depth, right? At least for the majors right now,
They've
I
got like
think
8 starters.
yeah, a bunch of starter depth. Like it's interesting to actually have legit starting prospects. in the
Hmm.
rotation down there with Adam Kloffenstein and Sam Robersa and Gordon Graceffo and Michael McGreevy. Like all of these guys might not end up as starters long term. I would expect Robersa probably to be the best of the group in terms of that, but these guys all look like they can at least pitch in the majors. So, and then there are a couple interesting names in the bullpen as well, although that's kind of been bled a little bit dry by guys getting called up. But like it looks like there are some legitimate major league caliber arms in the bull in somewhere in that pitching staff. I
Hmm.
just don't necessarily want to see them come up yet. So it's definitely an interesting team from that perspective. I also think that Single A Palm Beach has possibly the most interesting collection of arms I've ever seen Palm Beach have in a very long time. And I'm very, very curious to like time travel 3 years into the future and see where these guys end up. Because I have become pretty high on Quinn Matthews. He is looking so much better than he did in college when he was drafted. Chen Wei Lin is looking electric. Another international guy the Cardinals signed. Eshawn Henderson, he was like their 8th or 9th round pick last year, looks interesting. There's just a whole lot of guys who have legitimately good fastballs with high velocity. And then there is just a lot of good off speed stuff in there. So I think that's a group that's going to be really, really fun to follow. And I think we could see a number of like legitimate major league starting pitchers come out of that team.
Oh, that should be fun. And then, we've spent all this time talking about starters and all this stuff. We haven't even touched the two main ones, right? Takeo Roby and Tink Hence. And it looks like, at least as of late, Tink Hence is finally getting to go, that they're letting him, or he's developed enough that he can go a little bit deeper in games now.
Yeah, it's great. I actually love the way the Cardinals have handled Tink Hence because he was a very young kid coming out of high school, getting drafted with a really slight frame, not a ton of innings on his arm. I like that they kind of babied him, put the kid's gloves on him, and just kind of said, "Hey, you're only going to go 50 outings or 50 pitches in this outing." And then work his way up to like 60 by the end of the season. And the next season, he's 60, working his way up to like 70, 75. And now they're really starting to pull back. And it's great because they've kept his innings down. They've let him work in those kind of smaller outings, and now they're kind of expanding and saying, hey, what can you do third time, fourth time through the order? Can you sustain your velocity 90, 95 pitches into a game? Can you go 7 clean innings and pitch efficiently? All of this stuff matters now as he's getting close to making his major league debut, and he hasn't really been injured in this entire time. So I'm a big fan of how they handled him as a high school pitching prospect. I hope that if they take another high school pitching prospect, that is how they handle him moving forward. But he's a guy who looks like he could very well pitch at the top of the rotation. And I would love if he could work his way to AAA soon and maybe put himself in line for a rotation spot next year.
Yeah, it does feel like there's a little bit of that, of a backlog there at AAA, right? With, like you said, the number of the guys they got, but then they send down guys like Palante and Thompson. So, is that going to keep him at Springfield a little bit longer than it would have in other years? I don't know, and maybe that's a good thing. Like I said, we've talked about them rushing him around. It could be that that's a not a bad thing to make sure that he's established there. But also, baseball has a way of figuring these things out, so he may get an opportunity sooner than later.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. Pitchers tend to get hurt, so I wouldn't be shocked if a gap opened up for him here sometime
sure.
soon.
So what about Roby? I mean, I know I've seen him a couple times mentioned. I don't know exactly how his season has gone, but obviously he came over last year and kind of, besides Sagasy being the real breakout person, but really kind of the highlight of that trade and showed that what he could do when he's healthy. Is that continuing this year?
So Takeo Roby has not pitched well to start the year,
Mm,
which is rough. And I think he started 5 games and given up 7 home runs, just a lot of hits. I think some of that is going to start to normalize. I haven't been able to watch enough of Takeo Roby this year because I've just had way too many other things to be doing,
mhm.
which is unfortunate. And I actually am trying to carve out some time to watch his next start. But from what I've seen of him, it just feels like he's just off a little bit. His command's just a little bit off. His pitch locations are just he's not using everything in the right spot. He's using his fastball probably down at the knees a little bit too much and not up at the top of the zone and above the zone. He's leaving his nasty curveball of his just over the middle of the plate, middle, as opposed to middle down or middle below the zone. It's just things like that need to maybe get refined a little bit. And he's also playing in a launch pad of the Texas League
Yeah.
where everybody hits home runs. So I think a combination of just catching too much of the plate, not putting his pitches in the right spot, and then playing in the Texas League, it's all just kind of biting him a little bit to start the year. He's only 5 starts in, 23 innings. I do think he's going to come around. It's nice that at least Tink Hence is dominating. Maybe Roby takes a little bit longer to get back to that level of domination that he was showing at times last year. But I do think that he still has that electric top of the rotation stuff, and these 5 outings have not changed my opinion of that.
I was about to say, we had your boss at the Cardinal Nation, Brian Walton, on barely about a month ago now. And if I remember right, that he took Hens and you took Roby as the top prospect, or did I get those backwards?
Nope, you got it right. I took
Okay.
Roby as the top pitcher prospect, and he took Hence. And in my mind, it's they're in the same tier. They're
Right.
not separated by much. It's like splitting hairs. I think Roby's a little bit better because I'll take the whole arsenal over Hence's. But you also have the injury history of Roby. Hence has come out and looked better. This is going to be hilarious now when like Tekoa Roby just falls flat on his face and Tink Hence dominates. But you know what? If Tink Hence dominates, I'm perfectly happy with that result.
Yeah, yeah, but Brian may not let you live it down. I don't know.
No, he probably won't, which is great.
Oh, so we talked a lot about the pitching. What kind of hitting are you looking at? I know that a lot of people looking at Chase Davis because of the draft from last year, and I believe he's looking better than he did last year, right?
Yeah, he's looking better than he did last year, and that's simply because he's actually hitting for power
Hmm.
finally, which was kind of the calling card of his prospect status. It's kind of why the Cardinals drafted him was
Right.
his ability to hit for power, play center field. You just do pretty much anything you could want a baseball player to do. The problem is that he's not making a ton of contact, which is interesting. He's kind of struggled in the wood bat leagues in college. He didn't make a ton of contact up until his final year at Arizona, where he started to clean up his swing a little bit, hit the ball a little bit better. He's right now sitting at like a 32, maybe 33% strikeout rate in single A as a college prospect, which is definitely high. But it is important to remember that Chase Davis, for being a college prospect, was probably more in the category of not a very refined player. Like you probably want to think about him as a little bit more of like a high school guy who has really loud tools but still needs a lot of refinement. But at the very least, it's encouraging to see him hit for power. And I know he had in spring training, it looked like he was tweaking his swing a little bit, where he was trying to shorten up, maybe drop that leg kick a little bit, just kind of calm things down in the box and simplify them in an effort to make more contact. He's dropped that in the season where he's just reverted back to his original swing. So we'll see if his continued strikeout issues maybe lead him to going back to the tweaks that he's already toyed with. But at the very least, he's hitting the ball better than he did last year.
Well, yeah, that's a good thing because I mean the Cardinals can't afford, and we've talked a little about, but they can't afford to have a first round pick not pan out, not right now.
Yeah, I agree, and it would be nice, especially as we look at the Cardinals maybe not having a ton of production in the outfield, to see a
Mhm.
guy like Chase Davis who does possess currently the athleticism to play center field. Whether or not he will down the road remains to be seen, but that could be a guy who really helps the team. So it'd be nice to see him progress a little bit faster than he has been. But yeah, what you don't want to see is him like get stalled in Double A and not really make a debut for a while.
Yeah. So I mentioned Sagasy earlier. It seems to be have they been playing him at shortstop? Because it seems to be that he's still that guy that probably the next hitter to make a major league debut.
Yeah, so he's been playing shortstop all year, primary
Mhm.
shortstop. I don't think he's even played anywhere else actually all season. And I'm okay with that decision. I'm not sure I thought he had the chops to play shortstop full time, but for a guy who can hit like he can, I don't see why you don't try it. Just give him
Yeah.
that extra versatility. Maybe he comes up and he's more of like a Brendan Donovan, where you only want him playing shortstop in a pinch, but not
Mhm.
consistently. Maybe he's like a Paul DeYoung, where he's not the most athletic guy in the world, but he just makes plays. And from what I've seen from him defensively so far, he has made some nice plays. He struggled a little bit with consistency. He struggled a little bit when the ball was smoked really hard right at him, but all of that just kind of comes with learning a new position.
Yeah.
So I'm very curious to see how things go the rest of the year, and I'm cautiously optimistic that he can prove that he can at least handle it at like a fringe average to an average level.
And to go back to what we've been talking about, it's probably a nice thing to see that the Cardinals brought up Jose Fermin instead of him to be that backup uh, shortstop, middle infield type of guy. Because I'm sure there was a temptation to try to bump him up as well.
Yeah, I'm very glad they went with Fermin over Sajasi because Sajasi just has to play every day, and he's not going to learn shortstop by sitting on the bench.
Hmm.
So just call it Fermin. Fermin is probably never going to be a key contributor at the major league level. He's a great guy if you want to have him just kind of bump around, play some spots, maybe have occasional pinch hit at bats. But I am very glad they did not go with the temptation to add a potential impact bat to the lineup and instead left Sajasi down.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's and again, it's just interesting, whether they would have done that because last year it felt like the front office really flailed around trying to make sure that things didn't, continue to snowball, and then they continued to snowball, and I don't think that they're quite to that level. Yeah, the Jordan Walker thing initially kind of felt like that, but there was enough reasons there that you could understand it. They haven't quite pushed the panic button yet, I don't think.
Yeah, I completely agree.
So, along with your minor league stuff, you talked a little bit about the draft earlier. How much preparation do you do on the college players, the high school players that the Cardinals might take?
So my preparation is a little informal. Where pretty much Friday after work, I'll just turn on a college baseball game that looks interesting. Saturdays too. So sometimes I end up watching top prospects. Sometimes I just am watching random games, and I see players that stand out, and I make a note of it. And that one of those players actually last year was Quinn Matthews, who I ended up just randomly watching like 5 of his starts in college, and then the Cardinals drafted, and I was like, "Hey, this is great! I've seen this guy a million times." Um, and then others of it is just kind of seeing if I can dig up any data on some of the guys the Cardinals might take in the first round or second round, like some of those top like 60, 70 names in the draft
Mhm.
and getting to know them a little bit better. But it looks like it should be a fun draft class this year.
I mean, and again, you never draft for need, and you draft best available and all that fun stuff. But do you think it is pitching or is it hitting that they're going to focus on?
So I think it depends on how the draft falls. I think they're more likely to actually go with a hitter because the college hitting class, which is just a lot stronger than the college pitching class,
Hmm.
at least as of now. And it's really a college over high school class at the top right now. But if a guy like Chase Burns falls to 7, the Cardinals might be intrigued. I do think it's a little more likely, perhaps, for them to get a guy like a JJ Weatherholt, who was a potential like 1-1 candidate heading into the season before he had some injury stuff. I do think they're also going to look at a guy like Connor Griffin, who's a high school player who is a two-way guy, so they could develop him either way, but just has a lot of loud tools. And we know the Cardinals really like that, like really loud, toolsy high school bat archetype early in the draft. So he seems to fall right into that category. So I would not be shocked if he was at the top of their board if he makes it to 7.
Do you think that we've talked about Heim Bloom and his impact perhaps on the minor leagues? Do you think he's going to have? I'm sure he's going to be in the room, but how much a say do you think he gets in this pick as well, or is this more of a Flores and the scouting department side of things?
I think Bloom will be involved, especially if he's somebody we can attribute the pitching development changes to,
Mhm.
if they trust him enough to maybe listen to his advice and tweak things at the entire organizational level. I do think he'll have some say in who gets picked, but I think Randy Flores has built enough of a resume for himself that he will be the dominating personality when it comes to making that pick.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, all right. Well, Blake, it's been fun. I'm keeping you late tonight, but before we let you go, is there anything you're working on now? I know, like I said, you're writing pretty regularly at Viva and at the Cardinal Nation. So, what do you got in the pipeline?
So it's funny that you ask because I'm supposed to be posting articles on Sunday and Tuesday at BEB, and I have not thought for 1 second about what I am going to write those articles on this week. So I guess we will find out on Sunday, whatever comes out onto the page here.
Well, you can take a page out of Jason Hill's book. He always just posts to the podcast when he when he gets in here on his Saturday thing. So,
Yeah, there we go.
just take yourself out, just put this up, and you'll get a day of rest out of it. So,
Hey, there we go. That's not a bad call.
Blake, it's been a lot of fun. We'll have to do it again later on in the year and see what this minor league looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. Sounds great. Thanks for having me on, Daniel.
All right. It was great to talk with Blake this week. Next week, we're going old school. We're going to bring Dan Buffet in to talk about the Cardinals. So that should be interesting. But until then, for Blake, I'm Daniel. Good night.
The final time, Adam Wainwright, Yadier Molina in regular season play. Here it comes. All of them coming out. 3 icons in franchise history, spanning over 2 decades. Excellence here with St. Louis, as Adam said to Yadi and Albert, you guys go first.